What's up, guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Young Guns podcast. Recent rumor mill has speculated regarding the Pittsburgh Penguins. There's been leaks that Kyle Dubas is thinking to shake things up pretty drastically with his team. Obviously, the Pittsburgh Penguins are off to a 6-9-2 start to the regular season, and this is a team that organizationally has stated we want to make the playoffs this year after missing last year. Crosby, Malkin, Erik Karlsson, Letang, this was the core that they built for last season. They were a couple points short last year, and now this year they're off to a really mediocre start. There's a lot of issues with this team, and now we're in a situation where Kyle Dubas is looking to wheel and deal, as he's done already yesterday with the Lars Eller deal. So this is how I'll lead it off to you, Luca. I'm going to ask you, what do you make of this first move, and how do you see things progressing from here on in? Because things are pretty crazy, pretty wild now in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that a lot of people have been calling for a couple of years now. You look at the Penguins and you look at their roster, how they've shaped out this year, and also just in terms of the way they've played hockey, and it just doesn't look good. You've got Sidney Crosby on that team. You've got Evgeni Malkin. You've got Erik Karlsson, Rakell. There's some cool, good names on that list. Obviously, Chris Letang as well, who's another one that, has been a big name for Pittsburgh for a long time. The other issue, though, is that you look at the Pittsburgh Penguins, and they haven't seemed to be able to, find some consistency into their game. And the other problem, too, is that you can tell that they're just old, right? They're not the same team that they once were from a couple of years ago. They don't have the same pieces. They don't have the same, let's say, roster in terms of, the star talent that they have. I mean, Malkin and Crosby are still, at their best, and they're still, some of the best players in the league. But after that, their depth kind of falls off a cliff. And so I think for Pittsburgh, it's always been about, when they brought in Kyle Dubas, it was about, okay, what is Kyle Dubas going to do? Is he going to change the way Pittsburgh does things in terms of business? Is he going to find a way to tear it all down for Pittsburgh? And he kind of did it. He re-signed Malkin, he re-signed Letang, and it was kind of like, okay, we're running this as far as we possibly can, and we're going to try our best, along with the acquisition of Erik Karlsson, to make the playoffs and be a team that's going to be in the playoffs. The problem is that hasn't worked, right? And we're coming into a situation where, if you look at their stats through 17 games, there's 6 wins, 9 losses, 2 overtime losses. They've got 14 points, right? They've got the second most games played in the Metropolitan Division.
They get blown out. They get blown out in a lot of games. They've
got 68 goals against, right, which is the most in the Metro Division, and I believe it's the most in the Eastern Conference, right, which is an absolute shit show in terms of goaltending. They haven't been able to get – actually, it's the most in the league, which is a problem for Pittsburgh. And the other thing, too, is that, like Zach mentioned, they're getting blown out, right? They were down 6-0 in the first period against Dallas the other day, right, before eventually only losing the game 7-1 at the end of it. But that's not good enough. They just haven't been good enough. Tristan Jarry has been a real big liability for Pittsburgh. He was sent down to the minors, had an .836 save percentage in 3 games played. Jesper Blomqvist, .904 save percentage. He's 3-5 on the year. You know what? He's actually been a very impressive rookie for them, and he's actually given them some good hockey, considering the fact that the Penguins haven't played well. And then Nedeljkovic, he's got an .882, 325 save percentage. Again, just not where it needs to be able to be a playoff team. And then you look at some of the players on this roster of just guys that are producing points. Obviously, you've got Malkin, who's a point a game. You got Crosby, who's got 16 points, 17 games. You got Rakell, who's got 11 and 17. Karlsson, 10 and 17. And then after that, it kind of falls off, right? Letang, only 6 points in 17 games. And Brian Russ has 5 and 10. But besides that, they haven't really had much else, right? Drew O'Connor's playing on the first line. It's just a shit show for Pittsburgh in terms of roster construction. And then also,
look at them on defense. Their team defense was an issue for them last year.
Right.
Obviously, they brought in Erik Karlsson, who, granted, Erik Karlsson is who he is. And they brought him in, and he was kind of fit that similar mold of a Chris Letang last year, who struggles. A guy who plays a lot of minutes, who struggles at 5-on-5 defending. And Erik Karlsson is kind of the same way. And then in the offseason, who do you really bring in to supplement those guys? You bring in Matt Grzelcyk. Is he really the answer? I don't know. And it hasn't and it really hasn't worked out off the gate for them. And Erik Karlsson is somebody who this season, I've watched a lot of breakdowns of him, and I watched some of Pittsburgh's games, and the issue with him is that he can't defend the rush.
Right.
And they have a lot of defensemen who have a hard time suppressing scoring chances, and who struggle with just basics like gap control and just suppressing chances, like I said, off the rush. Like this is a really shaky decor defensively, and obviously Letang hasn't been off to the best start. Karlsson, 10 points in 17 games. A lot of those points came on the power play. But here's the deal here. He's not playing well, and reports came out as of late saying that he, from the former coach of the Sweden men's national team, is that Karlsson, even though he was selected this year, he shouldn't be there based on how he's playing. Right. So that is a pretty big indication in itself. And then, well, you mentioned their depth. Well, their depth has been catastrophic this year. I would argue it's as bad as it was last season. Right. Obviously Lars Eller was a guy that they just traded, who was, he was their fourth producing forward. And when you have a 35-year-old Lars Eller who's operating as your third line center, as your fourth best goal scorer among your forwards, that's a problem. And
he had the most goals on the team.
Yeah, he had 7 goals, right? He has 7 goals.
He had 7 points, not 7 goals. He had 4 goals, but he was like third on the team in goal scoring with Tyrell Beauvillier, right?
Exactly. And Beauvillier is a guy you brought in, you're thinking, okay, well, he's going to get a chance. He starts off the year playing on the top line with Crosby. You're like, well, he's getting an opportunity here. He's always been kind of a complimentary forward, struggles out of the gate. Michael Bunting, I know he's gotten some points as of late, but took him a while to get going. And that was another guy you thought, well, look, maybe this guy is going to be back to being a 20-goal scorer in this league.
Yeah.
And that's just disappointing. And obviously, because he was part of the Jay Gensel deal, that's another factor. And they don't have the depth scoring. Rutger McGroarty got sent down after a couple of games. And what exactly does this team do well right now? Maybe it's on their power play, but they can't keep the puck out of their net. They've had, granted, Blomqvist has been good, but average goaltending. On 5-on-5 defense, one of the worst in the league right now, and they don't get any depth scoring beyond Crosby and Malkin, basically.
Right. And I think the other thing, too, when you brought up Lars Eller, let's actually jump into it. So, obviously, the Penguins, had Lars Eller on their team. He had 7 points through 17 games this year. This is a guy that's a defensive center. He's played 1,000 games in the NHL, right? He was in Pittsburgh for a couple of years. At 3 years, he was there. And then obviously now ends up in Washington again, where he won a cup with them. And I think it's a smart move for Pittsburgh. I mean, you look at where Lars Eller is at in his career. He's a 35-year-old center. Again, like I mentioned, he won a Stanley Cup with Washington. Pittsburgh's going downhill, and Kyle Dubas is at a point now where I think he believes, and I think everybody believes, that Pittsburgh's going to be out of the playoffs. I mean, their performances just haven't been good enough. And so I think that at some point it's like, okay, let's start selling early and seeing what we can get. And, they acquire a 3rd-round pick in 2027. They acquire a 5th-rounder in this year's draft in 2025. I mean, it's good value. It's a good value for a guy who's 35 years old. He makes $2.45 million for this
free agent.
That's it. And he's an unrestricted free agent at the end of the year. And you know what? For Washington, what it does as well in terms of the acquisition is, it allows them to get better for a team that's 10-4 on the season and playing some really good hockey. Right, it allows them to bolster their team a little bit more, add a guy who can play on your 3rd or 4th line, and it makes it better. For Pittsburgh, I mean, it's a downgrade, but what it'll do for them is, it'll acquire draft capital, right? It allows them to also play Samuel Poulet, who is, one of their prospects, the 23-year-old forward, who hasn't really been given a chance with Pittsburgh to finally, be able to cement himself as maybe a full-time player on the roster and kind of see what you have in that type of player. So I think for Pittsburgh, it makes a lot of sense to be able to do that. My question to you, Zach, is you look at this roster right now, is there anybody on this list that you think would be movable in the sense where they can acquire some decent assets and be able to speed up this rebuild. Do you think they move a guy like Erik Karlsson now? Do you think they wait till the offseason? What would, if you're Pittsburgh, if you're Kyle Dubas right now, what's the next move that's on the table for you?
Well, I think Erik Karlsson, if he were to get traded this year, it would be definitely something closer to the trade deadline just because of the salary. You have to find a way to make it work. And first of all, teams are still trying to figure out how serious they are about contending. Obviously, there's some exceptions to that rule, but I think with the magnitude of that move, you're going to try to make it work with the cap. And he's also got a lot of term left, right? It's not just this season; it's 2 more years after, like you're projecting on the screen. And like who are my trade chips right now for the Pittsburgh Penguins? Well, if you scroll up to the forwards, actually, there are some expiring contracts on this team. Beauvillier is a guy who hasn't worked out. He could be a trade piece. A team looking to add some depth scoring. O'Connor, maybe Puljujärvi's been off to an okay start, but I think Pittsburgh want to wait and see a little bit with that. And I'm thinking, he's had a decent start to this campaign. He still could play. A guy like Rakell. Yeah. I know it's $5 million, but it's a very managed. A lot of teams would be willing to eat that salary for a guy who you could play in your top 6 and who's got some decent scoring pedigree. And I'm go back to Kyle Dubas' statement. Well, not statement, the leak. Yesterday's leak, which basically said that he's looking to do player in, player out moves, and then right after that statement was leaked, he goes on and gets 2 draft picks for Lars Eller, which, like you said, tremendous value. But if we're going with that approach, it leads me to believe that Pittsburgh wants to actually try to is looking to salvage this season, right? And if they're saying Crosby is going to be the centerpiece of our future because they're saying everybody's immovable except him, then leads me to believe they're trying to make a team for Crosby in the next couple of years for him to basically try to allow him to get back to the playoffs. The biggest trade that could happen though is Malkin. Like I think if they somehow move Evgeni Malkin, obviously that is just this guy's been part of the face of the organization. He's been right there with Crosby since he's been drafted, and obviously multiple Stanley Cups, and he's still playing at a high level.
Yeah.
But like, is that the only move I'm asking you this? Is that the only move they could do where they could somehow get a decent amount of assets that would help them now? Because if you trade Rakell, I doubt you're going to trade him to a team that has the kind of assets to give you in return, unless you're trading for a bad contract or something else. But with the other guys, I'm thinking maybe prospects, picks. Yeah. But I think Malkin is the only guy that could be like, okay, well, maybe you could get 2 assets out of this that could help you now. And then the next guy would be Erik Karlsson.
Yeah, I think. I look at this team, and the thing is that obviously, right, I'm looking at this going, they need to tear it down completely. Like, I'm talking trade Crosby, trade Malkin, trade Brian Rust, Rakell, Letang, Karlsson, just trade everybody that is, basically of value, and, rebuild from scratch, go through a full-on tear down, because that's what they need to do, right? The thing is that, like you mentioned, right, what assets are they really going to get? I think Evgeni Malkin has value at this point in his career, right? He's $6.1 million. I don't think a team is going to take $6.1 million for Evgeni Malkin, even though he's got 18 points in 17 games, 38-year-old player, who at any point can recline. And even if it's for this season and next season, there's a lot of cap issues going on. So unless it's a cap for cap kind of deal, I just don't see Evgeni Malkin, being able to be traded at the full cap hit. So you may have to retain there, right? But that's a guy that I think would have a lot of teams very interested in him. The only issue I think with Evgeni Malkin is I do believe that he has a no move clause, which he does, right? So in this case, what happens with Evgeni Malkin is he can basically decide where he wants to go if he does end up getting traded. And so I think that there is obviously some uncertainty there. With Rickard Rakell, what's fun about him and what's actually really good is he has an 8-team no-trade list. So what that does is it allows Pittsburgh to be like, okay, we can trade this guy to anybody else, right?
options.
You can limit exactly. You have options. You can limit it to certain teams that are interested in him, and then from there you take the best offer with Rakell, which I think could make sense. Again, for $5 million at 31 years old, I think at this point in the year would probably have to be a money in, money out kind of situation. But there's also term on his deal, and teams like when there's players with term, because sometimes what happens is that it's easier for them to have to build their roster for the future. Right? Michael Bunting, I don't believe has value right now. It would be hard for him to get traded. Same thing with Kevin Hayes and Cody Glass. So you're looking at like some of the low-end guys, obviously at the bottom of the list. I think Beauvillier, he's a guy that can provide depth. I think if you can get a 5th, 6th round pick for the guy, maybe you move him. Right? Drew O'Connor, kind of the same thing. Good depth.
Probably more. I think the Lars Eller move sets the tone for them. If you could get a 3rd round pick for a 35-year-old pending free agent, then I think with Anthony Beauvillier, you could expect a little bit more. Yeah. And I wanted to go back to Malkin. You said 6.1 is not that digestible. I think it's very digestible. Yes, he's 38 years old. He's still playing at a high level. There's minor injury concerns, yes, right, based on past seasons. But right, you have him for next year, and then he's a free agent, and maybe he walks away from the game completely. But is still Evgeni Malkin playing at an elite level, and I think actually a lot of teams would be interested to have a guy like that. Like a team like I don't think he ends up there, but I'm just looking at like a hockey fit. If you look at the Winnipeg Jets, you got Vlad Nemestikov as their second line center. You think this is not? I think there's a team that could use a guy like Evgeni Malkin to keep them at a high level and really set them over the top. A team that looking like they're gonna compete this year. Like we see this at all these past trade deadlines. Like Matt Duchene went for a crazy haul when he went to Columbus. And he was a guy that filled in a role as a second line center, and like top 6 centers, those guys you could get a lot for in trades. And obviously a guy like Malkin who's playing at a high level, I wouldn't really think otherwise there.
Yeah, I think one of their biggest assets, and it might be obviously a guy that isn't talked about, is Marcus Pettersson. This is a guy that obviously he's an unrestricted free agent at the end of the year. He's 28 years old. He's a decent top 4 defenseman. I think there's a lot of teams that would call on Pittsburgh for Marcus Pettersson. I think he's a guy that, in a change of scenery and obviously maybe on a team that's contending, could be a really good top 4 defenseman for them. He's probably one of their better stories compared to everything else that's going on defensively. Obviously, as you know, and you mentioned it with Erik Karlsson not playing so well defensively and Chris Letang just having a really down year, right? One of the positive signs is you can move a guy like Marcus Pettersson, and there are teams in the league that would be able to take him, who would want to bolster their D and bring in a guy who could potentially, fetch a pretty decent, let's say,
top return. 4.
Right, top 4 defenseman. And again, right, $4 million, even if Pittsburgh decides to eat up, let's say, half of that salary, right, it's still something that could work for them moving forward. So I think Marcus Pettersson's a really big story. And then obviously you have Karlsson and Letang. The issue is with Chris Letang, he's got 5 points in 17 games this year. He does not look like himself. And that contract is 4 more years at $6.1 million. It's going to be very hard to move Chris Letang. I think chances are he probably stays in Pittsburgh until that contract's over. Erik Karlsson's a little bit of a different story, because the thing with Erik Karlsson is this is a deal that, like you mentioned before, is going to probably end up being done in the deadline if it is done, right? And so the thing is, or in the offseason, and the thing with Erik Karlsson is he has to go to a team where he is going to be the primary focus in terms of defense, in terms of offense. And what that means is that if you look at what he did in San Jose, right, he was the main guy on defense in terms of, offensive defenseman, in terms of playing on the power play, right? He was being given kind of like a free will and a free rein to be able to do whatever he had to do and not necessarily worry about the team defense aspect of it, right? The problem is that he needs to be on a good, let's say San Jose wasn't a good defensive team, but he needs to be on a team where there's other guys that can complement Erik Karlsson's defensive game. Because if you put Erik Karlsson in a position where he's solely focused on getting points and being an offensive defenseman, you can get value out of that player, right? The problem with Pittsburgh is because Chris Letang isn't playing good hockey. And so because Chris Letang isn't playing good hockey and Erik Karlsson is being exposed for his defensive liabilities, you're having an issue there, because no matter what happens, right, Erik Karlsson is not going to be the best version of himself. And Chris Letang, who is supposed to be Pittsburgh's best defenseman, is not himself as well, right? So that's becoming a big problem for Pittsburgh. So I think for Erik Karlsson, there's value. I think we all know how good Erik Karlsson can be offensively. The question is obviously is his $10 million cap hit, right, with the Pittsburgh Penguins. And the other argument is, how much value is there and what team would be willing to, let's say, take on Erik Karlsson? And is he as good? Are you getting a better version of Erik Karlsson? Are you getting a worse version of Erik Karlsson? Right? Team Sweden's coach kind of called them out or whatever, like you mentioned before. So it's a tough trade piece to make. But I think for me, like we mentioned before, I think the two pieces that would probably, let's say, generate the most value for Pittsburgh is Rakell and obviously, Marcus Pettersson. And then in net, there's Nedeljkovic, who you can get some value for him. And Tristan Jarry's got no value because he hasn't played good hockey to start the year. He's looked good in the AHL, but at $5 million, right, no one's taking Tristan Jarry, especially not with the performances that he's put up as of late. And for $5.3 million until 2027, 2028, it's not a digestible contract for anybody to take on right now.
Yeah, and I think what's smart about their approach, what Dubas is doing, is that he's vocalizing it now at like right before the quarter mark of the regular season, saying, "Hey, I'm open for business." He's not saying it close to the trade deadline. He's saying it now. We're in mid-November, and that gives them more, because right now, not a lot of teams are looking to, well, obviously, one, wholesale half their team,
right,
or make these kind of moves this early into the season. But the teams that are willing to do that, like the teams that are getting desperate now, like the teams that are off the slow starts, like Pittsburgh, or where maybe a coaching change looms, they need players to find a change of scenery. They need to give different looks. You're gonna get equal value in these trades because there's teams that have the same need that you have. And if you wait towards the trade deadline, a lot of times half of the moves can't happen because it just doesn't work from a logistics standpoint. And then you get some value in the moves that you do make. But if you're saying we're open to business right away, there could be a lot of moves done from now till the trade deadline, and probably a lot more than what would have been done just in February. So there could be a lot of changes now, I think, in Pittsburgh. They're obviously a team that has ranked the 23rd best prospect pool in the NHL, and some ranked them even worse. Like this is a team that's lacking in the pipeline. They need something.
Right. And if you look at their draft pick summary, I mean, looking at their next three drafts, right? 2025, 1 first rounder, no second rounder, 3 third rounders, a 4th, 3 fifths, a 6, and a 7. And then in 2026 and 2027, they have a pick obviously 1 pick in the first round in each of those 2 drafts, 2 picks in the second and third round. And then 2027, they have 2 2027 4th round picks as well. So Pittsburgh is stockpiling draft picks. And I think they are starting to slowly prepare themselves to start drafting some players. But what's interesting about Pittsburgh is if you look at the draft this year, right, James Higgins is number 1, obviously Porter Martone, Roger McQueen. There's a couple of really good players available at the top. So if Pittsburgh can be a really good draft lottery team this year and start that rebuild and start, with a guy like James Higgins, let's say if they end up getting the first overall pick and they end up tanking, right, that could set their rebuild up a little bit nicely in terms of being able to figure out what their future holds, right? And the other argument is, they went to go make that deal for Rutger McGroarty. He hasn't really looked great in NHL games or AHL games. And what that does is it allows Pittsburgh to be able to evaluate their talent. They have Owen Pickering, who's down on the minors as well, who's a defenseman who's playing really well for Wilkes-Barre, right? He was a first-round pick for them as well. They also have Samuel Poulin, who I mentioned, who they called up and is going to be given a look. So they're starting to use a little bit more of their young guys to kind of see what the expectation is for them. They have John Gruden, who's another player that I think they have a little bit of expectations with. But Pittsburgh needs to start stockpiling draft picks. And I think they need to start accepting the fact that this is going to be a rebuild. And if they can do that, and like you mentioned, Dubas has already kind of started, and he did it subtly with the move of Lars Eller, right? If he ends up moving the big name of Evgeni Malkin or of Rakell or even of Erik Karlsson, right, that's going to kind of quietly turn around and go, okay, this one needs to be done. The other thing that I'm going to say and I believe that this is something that you can agree with, Zach, and then I think we'll like kind of end it off a little bit over here. I think Mike Sullivan has to go as well. I don't believe that we're at a point there in our career, in our season, or at this point in Mike Sullivan's career where he needs to prove any more than he has. It's not working anymore. His system doesn't seem to be working, and a lot of Penguins fans seem to be asking for him to be let go. And I think that if Kyle Dubas is going to embrace a rebuild, you need to start from scratch. Get rid of the coach, get rid of the players, and start from scratch and be able to move forward and start a new generation of Penguins players that are going to be able to come up and hopefully build you something for the future. Because I think Mike Sullivan, you can tell even that loss against Dallas, you can tell that the players are done with him. Like, you can just see it. You can sense it, right? There's tension there, and it just doesn't seem like it's going to get better.
Yeah. Right now, for me, because the statement, like the leak was so ambiguous, I don't know if they're trying to salvage the season.
Right.
More so if they're trying to set up the next couple of seasons by, rejuvenating their prospect pool, like you're saying.
Yeah.
Knowing Kyle Dubas, I think he's gonna, if we're going by how he's dealt with his position since being hired, I think if there's a move to upgrade the team now, he's a guy that has balls and is gonna pull the trigger 100%. But I think for a lot of these other moves, don't be surprised if he's adding prospects as well. Like, if you can kind of get the best of both worlds with these moves. I know that sounds idealistic, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's the approach. But they just have to see what the market is, and we could be completely wrong. It could be a situation where it's rebuild, and it's rebuild minus Crosby, or it's let's add some blue chip prospects, but let's also try to give different looks to Crosby in this core this season. So a lot looms with that. Any final comments?
No, I personally think that they shouldn't even try for this season. Like, not try. Obviously, you have games that you have to play. Like, go and play those games. But I'm saying, like, Kyle Dubas shouldn't be setting expectations. Like, this is a team that's not good enough, and I think we showed that at the beginning of the year. And Lars Eller getting traded, I think Kyle Dubas is starting to realize, like, okay, we need to start doing something, and we need to start focusing on the future and not what's going on right now. So I think for Pittsburgh, being a lottery team this year is probably the best move that they can make. And, exploring trade options and starting to build more for the future, I think is probably where they should start doing and start heading. And just if you compare Washington, I mean, they were in the same boat a couple of years ago, but Washington went into free agency and made very smart moves that ended up putting them in a position to where they are right now. With Pittsburgh, they're not able to do that, and unfortunately, they haven't been able to do that. So I think it's time to just tear it down and start from scratch again. If that means trading Crosby, so be it.
Yeah, fair enough.
So anyways, guys, thank you very much for watching. Click like to like this video, and obviously don't forget to subscribe. Stay tuned. We have some more videos coming up, and we'll see you guys in the next episode of the Young Guns Podcast. Peace.
All right, guys. Peace.